Hi, Barely Sapient here. Today we're going to take a look at gaming performance in three popular Ubuntu-based Linux distros. And we're going to do it on a GTX 1080 and an AMD Ryzen 7 2700X. Okay, so the three distros tested are Pop! OS 24.04. This is the first time on the channel that I've taken a look at Pop! OS. Linux Mint 22.3, and Zorin OS 18.1 core. The test system is an AMD Ryzen 7 2700X, that is an 8-core, 16-thread part, an Nvidia Geforce GTX 1080, 32 gigabytes of DDR4 memory at 32, clocked at 3200 mega transfers, and that is in dual channel configuration. A 512 gigabyte NVMe Gen 3 SSD, a 480 gigabyte SATA SSD, and a 256 gigabyte SATA SSD. Last time on the channel, we took a look at the GTX 1080. It was paired with an old Xeon with a heap of cores. Yeah, that choice was interesting and all, but it really suffered, the performance did anyway, in Counter-Strike 2. So it'll be interesting to see how the Nvidia GTX 1080 fares in Linux with a more rational CPU pairing in the Ryzen 7 2700X. It'll also be interesting to see which distro comes out on top on this one, as they're both, or all three of them, excuse me, are popular distros based on Ubuntu. Alright, so first up is Counter-Strike 2. And in Pop! OS, it did alright, but it could have done a lot better, as others did. Gameplay was smooth and enjoyable. It was well above 100 frames per second. But it wasn't on the level of professional gaming or anything like that. But then again, you wouldn't expect that from a 10-year-old GPU anyway. Did do pretty alright, as it averaged 161.2 frames per second, had a 1% low of 85.9, and a 0.1% low of 61.7 frames per second. So all in all, pretty good. Linux Mint, however, did a little bit better, as it averaged 170.8 frames per second, had a 1% low of 94.7 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 66.7 frames per second. So Mint did a little bit better. Zorin OS 18.1, however, did the best, as it had the highest average and the highest 1% low, and tied Linux Mint on the 0.1% low, basically, as it averaged 178.4 frames per second, had a 1% low of 100.6 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 66.6 frames per second. But all in all, a pretty good performance in Zorin OS in Counter-Strike 2. All testing for Counter-Strike 2 was done at 1080p with low settings, with the exception of dynamic shadows being turned to all for a competitive advantage. Next up is the original Crysis, and this is at 1080p at the highest possible settings. And in Pop! OS, it did okay. I mean, it's certainly playable and enjoyable at these settings. It averaged 62.5 frames per second, had a 1% low of 23.9 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 11.2 frames per second. So not a bad performance by Pop! OS, but it was the worst in this game. Linux Mint did a bit better than Pop! OS and actually had the highest average frame rate of the three Linux distros in this head-to-head matchup, as it averaged 80.1 frames per second, had a 1% low of 41.4 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 17.5 frames per second. All in all, it was a pretty enjoyable experience. Overall, Zorin OS had the most consistent performance of the three, and probably the best, as it averaged 67.8 frames per second, had a 1% low of 42.7 frames per second, but its 0.1% low was 36.6 frames per second. So miles ahead of both Mint and Pop OS on the 0.1% low. Next up is Cyberpunk 2077, and this is at 1080p at the lowest settings with FSR3 set to native AA. And what do I mean by the lowest? That means I set it to the preset of low and then went in and changed any of the settings to either their lowest setting or off to get this to play without the benefit of using any type of upscaling. And at these settings, the GTX 1080 does show its age. In Pop OS, it was somewhat playable. It averaged 44.4 frames per second, had a 1% low of 18 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 14.5 frames per second. So I could feel some of the slowdowns sometimes in Pop OS on this. Linux Mint 22.3 was actually the most consistent of the three distros at these settings in Cyberpunk 2077, as it averaged 48.5 frames per second, had a 1% low of 27.6 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 17.6 frames per second. Zorin OS 18.1 did pretty good as well. In comparison to Mint, it had a higher average, but a lower 1% low, and roughly about a little bit higher 0.1% low. It averaged 51 frames per second, had a 1% low of 23.1 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 18.7 frames per second. It was still consistent enough. Both Zorin and Mint were much more consistent than Pop OS in this one. Next up is Grand Theft Auto 5 Enhanced Edition, and this is at 1080p at high settings. All three distros averaged above 100 frames per second, and all three distros averaged above 40 frames per second for their 0.1% lows. So all of them did pretty well in this game. Here is footage from Pop OS, and at these settings, it averaged 105.1 frames per second, had a 1% low of 59.3 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 46.1. So a pretty good performance in this game for Pop OS. In Linux Mint, it had the highest average, but the lowest 1 and 0.1% lows. It averaged 106.3 frames per second, had a 1% low of 58.7 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 42.7. Still a very solid performance in Mint as well. Zorin OS had the lowest average frame rate, but was the most consistent and had the best 1 and 0.1% lows. It averaged 101.7 frames per second, had a 1% low of 62.7 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 49.7 frames per second. All in all, it was on all three distros, this game was smooth and enjoyable throughout. Next up is Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, and this is at 1080p Ultra settings. And Pop OS kind of struggled a little bit at these settings on this game, as it averaged 55.6 frames per second, which is fine, had a 1% low of 17.7 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 9.2 frames per second. And yeah, every once in a while you would feel that hitch in gameplay in Pop OS. It wasn't much better on Linux Mint 22.3, as it averaged 60.2 frames per second. It had a 1% low of 19.2 and a 0.1% low of just 10.2. It felt very similar to Pop OS's performance in this game at these settings. The game performed best at these settings in Zorin OS, as it averaged 61.5 frames per second, had a 1% low of 21.9 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 16.7 frames per second. Next up is Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor, and this is at 1080p Ultra, and in the in-game benchmark, it looks like Linux, or actually Pop OS, had the highest frame rate and the highest average, but Zorin OS had the highest minimum. And then there's Linux Mint. I'll have all the scores at the bottom there below. Next up is Oblivion Remastered, and on the GTX 1080, this game is quite GPU limited. I had the settings chosen, and which was 1080p low settings, and this is with no upscaling. And at these settings, Pop! OS did okay. It was playable, but certainly not ideal as it averaged 44.4 frames per second, had a 1% low of 24.1 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 13.8 frames per second. So sometimes the gameplay would be, you would feel a hitch. In Linux Mint, the performance was quite similar as it averaged 44.1 frames per second, had a 1% low of 24.9 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 13.4. In Zorin OS, it wasn't much better. The only difference is the 0.1% low was a little bit better. It averaged 45.3 frames per second, had a 1% low of 24.4 frames per second, and it did have a 0.1% low of 16.9 frames per second. Gameplay, it didn't feel much different than the other two distros. The GTX 1080 at these settings is, well, it's GPU limited at this point. It's consistently in the high 90s most of the time. And yeah, this game definitely makes the GTX 1080 show its age. To be fair though, Oblivion Remastered does not scale well with older hardware and is an unoptimized mess. Next up is God of War, and this is at 1080p at ultra settings, and this was just a little too much for Pop! OS, as it averaged 41.4 frames per second, which is fine, not ideal, but fine. However, its 1 and 0.1% lows were a little too low, as it was 19.2 and 15.3 frames per second, respectively. So when I was playing, I could feel some slowdowns at times. In Linux Mint 22.3, God of War was the most consistent out of 3 distros. It averaged 48.4 frames per second, but had a 1% low of 38.7 frames per second and a 0.1% low of 29 frames per second. So gameplay was smooth and very consistent throughout. At these settings, in Zorin OS 18.1, gameplay was perfectly playable. It had the highest average and was consistent enough. It averaged 51.9 frames per second, had a 1% low of 33 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 25.9 frames per second. So still miles ahead of Pop! OS, and still enjoyable to play at these settings. Next up is Sker Ritual, and this is a zombie shooter from 2024, and it's a fast-paced zombie shooter, so I aimed to get 100 frames per second, and I was able to get it pretty close to it on all 3 distros at 1080p at medium settings. And in Pop! OS, it actually had the lowest average, but very, very consistent. It averaged 97.1 frames per second, had a 1% low of 63.1 frames per second, a 0.1% low of 40.4 frames per second. In Linux Mint, it had very similar numbers, a higher average but a lower 0.1% low, as it averaged 100.1 frames per second, had a 1% low of 61.3 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 37.4 frames per second. In Zorin OS 18.1, again, very similar numbers, as it averaged 101 frames per second, had a 1% low of 63.2 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 37.7 frames per second. So it looks like Pop! OS was the most consistent out of the 3, would have the lowest average. Next up is Arc Raiders, and this is at 1080p high settings with FSR set to quality. And in Pop! OS, it did okay. It's still reasonable performance, as it averaged 75.6 frames per second, at a 1% low of 41.2 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 30.6 frames per second. But it did the worst out of the 3 distros. Linux Mint 22.3 actually did the best in Arc Raiders, as it averaged 90.6 frames per second, had a 1% low of 48.3 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 34.1 frames per second. So it had the highest average and was the most consistent out of the 3 distros. Zorin OS was middle of the pack in this one, as it averaged 83.8 frames per second, had a 1% low of 46.2 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 32.5 frames per second. Now, the game was perfectly playable on all three distros at these settings, and Arc Raiders tends to be a fairly well optimized game. As long as you have decent enough hardware, it should run fine. And the GTX 1080 is definitely that. So out of the three distros on this hardware, Pop! OS by far did the worst. For performance on games from the GTX 1080's era, it did the worst. And games older than the GTX 1080, it did the worst. In newer games, Pop! OS again did the worst out of the three distros. I think it's safe to say that Pop! OS is not a good choice if you have an Nvidia 10 series or older card. It's just not made for that, apparently. It's just, yeah. Now, Linux Mint and Zorin OS traded blows, but Zorin OS did end up on top. It had the better performance out of these 10 games. And if you're looking for a general usage distro, Zorin OS seems to be competitive with gaming distros, from what I have seen so far. Linux Mint's not a bad choice, and it's certainly a better choice than Pop! OS on older NVIDIA hardware like this. Hopefully Pop! OS at least is good on AMD hardware or newer NVIDIA hardware, but on this hardware, no. Pop! OS is clearly not the choice if you want to do some gaming. Here in June of 2026, the AMD Ryzen 2700X is a reasonable choice for a gaming CPU. It can still hold its own. Now, the GTX 1080 can do some 1080p gaming still, actually quite a bit of it, but it is beginning to show its age. Anyways, I hope you liked the video, and I will catch you in the next one. Like and subscribe if you like the video, and comments are always welcome.